Thank you so much for inviting me to give this presentation. I just want to very briefly say what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to give you like a catalogue of possible communication impairments or whatever, because that would be supremely boring. Well, it could be fascinating for some of us sitting in this room, like my colleagues there in the back. But just briefly, a little bit about myself. So yes, my primary day job is that of the head of School of Clinical Therapies at UCC. So we graduate healthcare professionals in audiology, occupational therapy, physiotherapy, and speech and language therapy. So that means what we kind of have baked into what we do is an interest more in people what people can do rather than what people can't do. We absolutely do need to know about deficit, but you don't build on deficit. You build on what somebody can do. So the starting point for any collaboration, for any habilitation, rehabilitation, working together or whatever, has to be what we can do, and specifically what we can do together. So there we are. So I'd also, as the head of speech and hearing sciences, what I have baked into myself is, well, a background in languages, linguistics, philology, all of that good stuff. So an interest in communication and what it actually means is very dear to my heart. And what is one of my perennial bugbears is that very often communication and the ability to communicate is sometimes treated as a nice to have rather than as absolutely essential to who we are as human beings. So my take on communication and also on cognition is that I take it back to our fundamental human nature as tool users. We make use of whatever is at hand to manage our lives and to learn, to create, to shape our world and to speak our world into existence. And that is absolutely fundamental to being a human being. So we make use of whatever and whoever is at hand to help us with the job of making sense of the world. And when you come to think about it, doing research is essentially making sense of the world. And while we're at it, hopefully improving it for whoever comes after it. So communication is the most sophisticated box of tools that we have to make sense of the world, and the most essential one. Further, basically, when you think about communication and language, there's two basic functions to it, and I'm just throwing these things at all of you because I can, because it's me standing up here. But maybe as a few thinking points as well for our discussions later on, because basic function number one of language and communication, it's the gremlins. I just blame it on the gremlins. They're after me. By communicating, by using language specifically, we create our understanding of the world for ourselves and for others. But we also create and project who we are and how we relate to other people. And again, I just want to throw this out there maybe as, like I said, a thinking point for later. We talk about communication need. All of us have communication needs. Some of us may have a diagnosed communication disorder, impairment, disability. I'm not going to read this out, but for future reference, this is a definition of communication disorder and disability. Who is at risk for diagnosis of communication disorder and disability? Well, all of us. I'll be 60 a little bit later this year, so I tell my students, one of the things I teach is around dementia and neurodegeneration. I tell my students that in 25 years' time, if I live that long, I have a better than 50% chance of qualifying for a diagnosis of dementia. By that time, by the time that diagnosis lands on my case file, I will have a communication disability, because that's part of the diagnostic process. As I age, I'm also at increased risk of stroke. I am also at increased risk of, for example, Parkinson's disease. I'm also at increased risk of age-related hearing loss. I mean, that is so common that we hardly talk about it anymore. It's just out there. So we all are at risk. So why does it matter involving people with communication need, communication disabilities in setting the agenda and developing research? Well, some numbers, when we think about Down syndrome, circa 7,000 people living with Down syndrome at present in the Republic of Ireland. I apologize to our colleagues from the north, because it's really difficult to get all Ireland numbers for any of these conditions. Parkinson's disease, something like 90% of people with Parkinson's disease experience significant speech disorder or dysarthria. You wouldn't know about that looking in a lot of the literature, publicly available literature on Parkinson. A lot of people are living with dementia in this country. Something that we don't often talk about so much is the very significant impairments that come with traumatic brain injury, injuries following, for example, a car accident, motorcycle accident. Oh yeah, that's another risk. I cycle in Cork City, so there's possibly a TBI with my name on it out there, I don't know. So there's a lot of communication consequences to do with conditions that we don't normally primarily define as a communication disorder, such as what happens to your brain when you have a car accident. And then there are conditions such as developmental language disorder, such as aphasia, and there's people in this room who know an awful lot more about aphasia than I do. So again, discussion points for later on. So I would just like to reflect for a minute or two on this term, and I'd like to thank my colleague Caroline Jago at TCD, who's done a lot of work in this area of epistemic injustice and how it relates to people with a variety of disabilities. In other words, the definitions from Miranda Fricker around injustice inflicted on somebody as someone who knows. We talk a lot about experts by experience, but who gets to talk about their experience? Who gets to set the agendas? And which experiences are valued and which experiences are less valued? And sometimes not by, deliberate exclusion, but maybe exclusion out of convenience. I'll come back to that. So we're talking about testimonial injustice, the injustice done to individuals because others don't hear their testimony, because there are social roles associated with less credibility. I don't know whether any of you have ever been in the situation where you've lost your voice completely because you've had a cold or whatever going on. It is unbelievably difficult to manage, especially if you have to convince somebody of something and you can't talk properly, because they're not going to take you seriously. And then also hermeneutic injustice, the injustice of having significant area of one's experience obscured from collective understanding owing to structural identity prejudice in the collective hermeneutical resource. You can tell that Miranda Fricker writes from a background in philosophy. But what it boils down to really is the question of, as I said earlier, whose voice gets heard in what context. And so what we can also think about is, if we're talking about palliative care, if we're talking about hospice care. There are a lot of people with chronic conditions that primarily don't, or may not, have anything to do with a communication disability. But we all are, again, at risk of chronic conditions, or indeed transient conditions. Some cancers are cured, others are not. And Kidd and Carell, it's an interesting paper to look at. They're specifically right from the context of healthcare provision rather than building research partnerships in healthcare, but they call out specifically people with chronic conditions. And if people with chronic conditions, chronically ill persons, are specifically vulnerable, we can also add that people with communication disorders or disabilities likewise are particularly vulnerable to epistemic injustice or to not being heard. And so, again, some questions to ask ourselves, and to some extent this goes back to our previous presentation as well. To what extent do our research practices, including the involvement of people, variety of people at all stages and at the planning stages, to what extent do we perpetuate epistemic injustice? So who gets to set the research agendas? Who even gets to learn about the possibilities of getting involved in setting the agendas? We get a lot of regulation about informed consent. There's a lot in research projects around language competencies, literacy requirements. And why does it, if it happens, why does it happen? Is it because we just can't be bothered? That's one possibility. Is it because a lack of inclusiveness is kind of baked into research processes? I don't know. Is it because in some arenas of research, communication, ability and disability is just not on researchers' horizons, so we don't even think about it? Is it about financial pressure, time, convenience, expedience, all of the above? And then what can we do to counteract epistemic injustice in what we do at all levels of the research process? And that's me. So thank you very, very much for your attention. And thank you.